This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more permanent. What is failing right now does not look like collapse. It looks like order. It looks like management. It looks like someone stepping in to fix a system that no longer works. That is the danger. Because when failure becomes administrative, it stops feeling like a crisis. It starts feeling necessary, temporary, rational. And once that logic takes hold, sovereignty is no longer a right. It becomes conditional, performance-based, revocable. You are told this is about safety, about stability, about lowering risk. But watch carefully. Because when control replaces consent, it does not announce itself. It normalizes itself. If you want to understand how power is changing right now, stay with me. This is the moment where the rules quietly shift. And once they do not shift back. What actually controls the system now is not ideology, not diplomacy, not even elections. It is logistics, energy flow, price stability, security guarantees enforced upstream, far from where consequences are felt. Power no longer waits for consent. It preemptively manages risk. It identifies weak nodes, and it steps in before disorder spreads. This is why personalities no longer matter. Because once a system is framed as a threat, the response becomes automatic, technocratic, repeatable. The language shifts from politics to maintenance, from sovereignty to stewardship, from borders to supply chains. And when that happens, intervention stops sounding like aggression. It sounds like responsibility. The danger is not that this logic exists. The danger is that it works, at least in the short term, because every successful intervention teaches the system the same lesson. Control is faster than consent and far more predictable. That lesson is spreading quietly. And once you see where it leads, you cannot unsee it. There was a time when this kind of power moved slowly, cautiously, wrapped in debate, before intervention required persuasion, coalitions, legitimacy that had to be argued for. Now compare that to the present. The shift did not arrive with a speech. It arrived with normalization. Control stopped being exceptional. It became procedural. What used to be called occupation is now framed as stabilization. What used to be extraction is now called reimbursement. What used to be coercion is now described as risk management. And because the change happened incrementally, it felt invisible. Each step seemed reasonable on its own, temporary, limited. But together, they rewired expectations. The question is no longer, should power intervene? The question is, how efficiently can it do so? That is what makes slow change dangerous. It bypasses resistance. It dissolves memory. By the time anyone notices what has been surrendered, the system has already adjusted to life without it, and the next move no longer feels radical. It feels inevitable. Then came the shock that made this impossible to ignore. Not a debate, not a vote, a move. A state was treated as a malfunctioning asset, secured first, rebuilt later. The justification was simple: security, containment, stability. The language was surgical: helicopters, fortifications, control points, overwhelming force, deployed not to punish, but to administer. This was not framed as conquest. It was framed as necessity, as intervention before contagion spread. And notice what was missing: no end date, no timetable for withdrawal, no clear threshold for restored sovereignty, because this wasn't a crisis response. It was a systems decision, a signal that failure would no longer be negotiated with. It would be managed. If a state could not function, someone else would function in its place. And once that line was crossed, the question was no longer whether this could happen again, but where. Here is the mechanism that makes all of this possible. Control is no longer justified by ideology. It is justified by balance sheets. When intervention pays for itself, resistance collapses. Resources become collateral. Infrastructure becomes leverage. Reconstruction becomes revenue. The system no longer asks, can we afford to intervene? It asks, why wouldn't we? Those who control extraction, control recovery. Those who manage flow decide who stabilizes and who waits. And notice how clean the math looks. Revenue offsets risk. Stability lowers prices. Lower prices generate political consent at home. Everyone appears to win. On paper. But this is where the damage is absorbed. Sovereignty is postponed. Local agency is deferred. Decision-making is centralized, far from consequences. The beneficiaries are immediate and visible. The costs are delayed and diffuse. That asymmetry is the engine, because when profit and power align, the system stops asking moral questions. It starts optimizing, and once optimization becomes the goal, there is no internal brake, only expansion. Then the pace accelerates. No pose, no explanations. One move triggers another. Control creates dependency. Dependency creates leverage. And leverage is used. Energy flows are redirected. Prices react. Allies adjust. What looked like a local fix begins to ripple outward. Supply chains tighten in one place, loosen in another. Pressure shifts. Suddenly, entire regions are recalculating not values, but exposure. Who depends on whom? Who can absorb disruption? Who cannot? This is where the system reveals its speed. There is no debate phase, no waiting period. Decisions are executed before opposition can organize, before memory can catch up, and each successful adjustment reinforces the logic. If it worked there, it can work elsewhere. If resistance failed once, it will fail again. The system learns quickly, faster than politics, faster than law. And once acceleration begins, it does not slow down on its own. It looks for the next weak point. This is where it reaches you, not as theory, not as foreign policy, as consequence. Because when systems optimize for speed and control, they do not ask who absorbs the shock. They assume someone will, and very often, that someone is you. You feel it when prices move before explanations arrive. When decisions are made far away, but paid for close to home. When stability is promised, but volatility keeps leaking through. You are told this is working. That order has been restored. That the system is under control. But notice what you are not invited into. You do not consent. You adapt. You adjust expectations. You recalibrate what feels normal. You absorb changes that were never put to a vote. That is the quiet trade being made. Efficiency in exchange for agency. Predictability in exchange for voice. And once you accept that bargain, even temporarily, it becomes very hard to reverse. Because systems that learn they can bypass you will keep doing it. This is not distant anymore. This is structural, and it is still unfolding. Now the ripple moves beyond borders. Because systems built on control do not stay contained. They propagate. Other states watch closely, not the speeches. The outcomes. They see which interventions succeed, which ones stabilize prices, which ones face no meaningful resistance. And they adjust. Some align early, hoping to be managed rather than targeted. Others harden, racing to insulate themselves before the model reaches them. This is how a doctrine becomes architecture. Not imposed by treaty, but by precedent. Once resource control proves effective, it stops being exceptional. It becomes an option on the table. And that is when uncertainty spreads. Markets price it in, governments hedge. Alliances quietly recalibrate because no one knows where the threshold is anymore. What counts as failure? What triggers intervention? The rules are no longer written down. They are inferred And inferred rules are the most destabilizing kind, because when everyone is guessing, everyone prepares for the worst. And preparation at this scale changes behavior long before any decision is announced. From here, the future does not branch once. It splits three ways. The first path is adjustment. States recalibrate. They comply early. They trade autonomy for predictability. Intervention becomes background noise, rarely discussed, quietly accepted. The system stabilizes, but at the cost of permanent supervision. The second path is erosion. Control spreads unevenly. Some regions are managed, others are neglected. Inequality deepens between those inside the system and those left outside it. Legitimacy decays slowly, not through collapse, but through fatigue. And then there is rupture, a miscalculation, a state that refuses management, a resource shock that cannot be smoothed, a population that no longer absorbs pressure quietly. In this path, speed becomes a liability, optimization outpaces understanding, and control, applied too broadly, provokes resistance it cannot easily contain. None of these paths announces itself clearly. They overlap. They blur. What matters is this. Once sovereignty becomes conditional, the future is no longer negotiated. It is enforced, and enforcement, by its nature, always invites a test. The only question is where that test will come from and how prepared the system really is when it does. This is not the moment where everything resolves. It never is, because systems like this do not collapse dramatically. They persist, they adapt, they wait. What you are watching is not a policy debate. It is a rehearsal, a test of how much control can be normalized before anyone asks who authorized it, a test of how often stability can be delivered without consent before consent stops being expected at all. The danger is not that this model fails. The danger is that it succeeds just well enough to be copied, well enough to be expanded, well enough to become the default response to disorder everywhere. And once that happens, reversal is no longer a decision. It becomes a crisis. So the question is not whether this system is powerful. It clearly is. The question is whether a world built on managed sovereignty can ever stop managing, or whether it will always need one more intervention, one more exception, one more justification. If you want to understand where this goes next, who gets managed, who resists, and what happens when optimization finally meets its limit, stay with me. Because the most important phase of this story has not arrived yet.